So back in 2019, a coach that I supported at the time, he was a coach of a high-profile college Division I team. He brought me in to observe his practices, his team meetings, and his games to give them feedback. As well as while I was there to facilitate a workshop with his team. Now, when it came to this workshop, I designed something like I always do, right? It's based upon the needs of the team. So through my weekly coaching calls with the coach, right, I had a pretty good feel of the dynamics within the culture, knew some of their challenges, their biggest challenge in particular. I also did some one-on-one virtual interviews with the players on the leadership council beforehand. And the coach also communicated what he believed were the most important objectives when it came to this team workshop. And as he said, nothing too heavy at this stage of the season, right? He wanted 2 hours together to achieve three things. The first was just to have some fun as a team. The second was to grow closer together as a team. And the third was to spend 30 minutes, kind of learning about outward versus inward mindset. Now, these first two objectives, they're very common, especially at this stage of the season. Coaches are concerned about player burnout in this team. And, they've just been through a brutal travel schedule and they just need to have some fun together, right? They were winning, things were going well in that regards, but the feeling of the culture was exhaustion. The third objective, right, learning about outward versus inward mindset, is kind of slipped into the objectives. And it was there to address an issue that the head coach knew was an issue, every player on the team knew was an issue, and every person on the program knew was an issue, including me. Like, I knew what this issue was, and it was one player was absolutely toxic. He was toxic on the court, super selfish in his behaviors, his attitude, and he was even worse off the court. He was absolute cancer off the court. And so the coach hoped that by educating the team, teaching this player in particular about how you can choose to have an inward mindset where you see people as objects, they're obstacles, vehicles, or irrelevant, or you can see people as people, outward mindset. He hoped by teaching them this that they might change, in particular, that this player might change. Well, what happened? The team had fun in the workshop. They laughed. They got to know each other a little better. Honestly, I did a great job of teaching the inward-outward mindset concept. And it's quite possible every kid walked out of there not only knowing, but was a little bit inspired to be a little more outward in their lives. Except after that, nothing changed within the team. Right? This player continued to be a cancer, possibly even more so. And the team was miserable the rest of the season, despite making a deep run in the tournament. Now, the irony is this. The reason the team was burnt out, it's not because they weren't having fun. It wasn't because they didn't do enough fun team activities in the group. It was because they never addressed the elephant in the room. They never addressed the biggest obstacle to their culture. What I have learned in the last few years of my work as a coach, consultant, and facilitator is the majority of team building activities and workshops are arguably a waste of time, or at least they are failing to address what's really getting in the way of a positive team experience and hurting the team's performance. Like, you can design a fun activity for your team and for connection, but if there's something already in the way and you fail to address that obstacle, you'll never be successful. Coaches think in these moments of the season that their team needs more downtime, more fun, right, to get loose. And while they may need some of that, those things can be achieved during team meals or a bus trip. If you want to move the needle with your team, if you're going to bring your team together for a team building activity or workshop or a team meeting, you have to be prepared, as the author and consultant Patrick Lencioni says, you have to be prepared to enter the danger. You have to be prepared to have hard conversations. You need to be intentional in your time together. And how you do that is what we are going to discuss today on the Coaching Culture Podcast. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. My name is JP Nerman, and I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts, Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. In addition to this podcast, I'm the founder of TOC, which supports leaders and their team to build extraordinary cultures through one-on-one coaching, consulting, online training, and speaking. You can learn more about my business, TOC, and subscribe to our newsletter at tocculture.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at JP Nerban. and Instagram and YouTube and TikTok at TOC Culture. You can also learn more about Betsy at betsybutterick.com. All right, so today's episode is all about effective team building or team bonding, as we're going to call it today. But before we kind of jump into what is effective team bonding, I want to start by really clarifying what we mean by this, because I know all three of us are in agreement that not all team bonding is equal or the same. And so we're going to differentiate between kind of maybe team bonding and team activities. I know that the three of us have been and are continuously brought in to work with coaches and their teams. And so this is really, really important work for us, stuff that we're a space that we're in a lot. And so we definitely have some ideas on what to do and what not to do at that time. But Betsy, I'll kick it over to you. Just kind of lay out for our listeners today, what's the difference between team bonding and maybe team activities?
And to your point, JP, I'll often get emails, let's say, from coaches, and they're like, hey, we've got some time coming up next week, or do you have some team building activities that we can do? And that's where it stops. There's no context. It's just, do you have some team building activities? And I think that's one of the challenges, both for coaches and for athletes, with things like team building and how it's different from maybe team bonding or team experience, is when it is an activity that we do one time and expect to reap the benefits all season. And I know, Nate, you had a lot of insight to offer on kind of what's the difference between an activity that we do as a team and something that we experience as a team that has a long-lasting effect. So can you talk a little bit more about the elements you brought up prior?
Yeah, well, I think when people think about team building, it's like exactly what you described there. They've got an hour of time, and at the end of that hour, they'd like their team to feel more closely bonded together, or more unity, or everybody to get along better. But they expect that shooting paintballs or going bowling or having a pizza party or watching a movie is going to magically accomplish those things. And I think the three of us, we've done this long enough, know that that is not the case. Certainly without any intentionality or purpose behind it, there really aren't magic bullets where you just, here's an activity, and all of a sudden your team is going to be transformed simply by doing the thing. And that's probably a little bit discouraging in a sense that we're looking for more, but more is going to be required for us to really get to that place where our teams have bonded, or our teams are built closer together as a result of that time being spent intentionally.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that doing those types of things you just mentioned, they're not necessarily bad for the team. Just like I would say having a motivational speaker come in and work with your team isn't necessarily bad for the team. I just don't know how much it's going to actually really move the needle when it comes to a team culture that is connected, has hard conversations, is willing to challenge each other, right? Is really, really bonded, right? In the way that we want them to be, so that they can go through the challenges of a season. So this is what we're really aiming at, is what can we do with teams, whatever our context is, how can we create spaces for our teams to really deepen those connections, to be willing to have hard conversations, to challenge each other, build meaningful relationships and memories. And I think that's what we're going to really dive into today. So when you're thinking about doing a team bonding experience for your team, where do you start? How do you start to plan this type of event?
I think the most important thing for us, to begin with, is where is our team at and what does our team need? A lot of times that's a little bit reflective of the time of year or the time of season. For example, we'll do a couple of things together early in the season because our team needs to connect. They're coming from different fall sports. Some of them were in a fall sport. Now we're in practice for the first time over the first couple of weeks, and they literally haven't been together as a team, well, since the previous season for those that are returning, plus you're adding freshmen in the mix. And so there's just a level of comfort and familiarity and, recognizing, okay, this is who we are. This is the group that we are, and trying to start to become a little bit more comfortable with each other and welcoming the new members in. So if we're thinking about a team activity early in the year, that purpose is connection, right? And that purpose is maybe getting to know each other a little bit better. And so that would lead us to go in one particular direction. Now, middle of the year, once we go through a storming period, right, there's going to be a different purpose a lot of times for what we do together as a team. Certainly, we will still continue to connect and do things that are fun, we hope. But there are also times where, look, some things got to get figured out, whether that's the roles on our team, whether that's how we're playing, whether that's overcoming some obstacles, dealing with some adversity. Maybe we have confidence issues, maybe we have chemistry issues, but those storms are going to happen for everyone. And that requires something different. What that thing is, it really depends, again, on your team, where your team is at and what your team is trying to work its way through. But if we're trying to, deal with playing time issues, for example, or people that are sort of resisting their roles, going bowling is not going to solve that problem. There's got to be something more to it there that's going to really surface what the issues are and allow us to be able to deal with them. As long as I'm on the schedule of the season here, the latter third of the season, a lot of times we transition to a more reflective period where we want our seniors kind of looking back and appreciating this experience that they've created and wanting to enjoy that before it's over and have their teammates appreciate them. That puts us in a really good place to get ready for the postseason. But generally speaking, just to say we need a team activity every month, that's not quite enough to figure out exactly what's going to best serve our team, depending on what we need at the time.
And when I think about the most successful programs that I've been able to observe, one that stands out for me, UCLA women's soccer, since Marguerite took over, one of her assistants, Molly and Goth, they're the original ones that came in when Marguerite began. And Molly specifically was tasked with, this culture piece. So while all three coaches were working on it together, Molly was largely responsible for bringing in these team building activities. And what I loved about how UCLA women's soccer did team bonding is it was never a one-time activity. It was an embedded part of their culture. I think it was Wednesdays or maybe Thursdays, but it was one day a week where they would take a certain period of time. And it was never long. And that was the other thing that I loved is sometimes when we think about team building or team bonding, Nate, you mentioned an hour. It's like, okay, we've got this hour or we've got this one day where we're going to do an offsite. Those are great. And can we bring this idea, this intention of bonding our team together into our weekly planned practices? Can we set aside 5, 10, 15 minutes to do one thing that serves a purpose given the context of that week or that part of our season? If we can do that intentionally over time, we almost don't need, they're fun, we almost don't need those big aha moments because we have these consistent small insights that get us to a place where, we do have that chemistry, that connection, that understanding, and we're being really responsive instead of planning this thing months in advance and then hoping that that's also what's needed at that time.
I really appreciate what you shared as well, Nate, there, because I think, and I know some of these people that have reached out to me over the years or listened to this podcast, people are always like, you need to put together a curriculum, of like lessons that you would do with the team over the course of the year. And I'm like, could do that, but it's not necessarily going to address the needs of your team. But what you offered, Nate, was like a framework, right? Like of the course of the season, this is kind of the trajectory of what we're trying to follow, knowing that if you don't establish connection early on, you're really never able to have the conversations you need to have in the middle of the season. If you don't establish connection early on, or you don't fight through those storms, then you really don't have much to reflect on that's going to be too positive, right? And kind of what you shared there is almost like it somewhat mirrors Daniel Coyle's, 3 elements of a great culture in his book, The Culture Code, which is we're establishing safety, we're sharing vulnerability, through the struggles, and at the end, it's kind of, having this shared purpose, right? So you kind of the reflective piece. So I love that framework, and I think coaches can take that framework and look at their course of this, look at the schedule of the season. It's like, okay, like to Betsy's point, we're scheduling things here, and we know, right? We can start to think about early in the year, we're going to have to try to do a little bit of this, then middle of the year, maybe a little of that. Later on in the year, we can do a little bit more of this, but this really also comes back to, like you said, Nate, what does our team need and where are we? I was thinking about my wife who just came off a team offsite at her work at Google, and it was brilliant, right? She came back so energized and excited to be a part of the team. One thing they did to prepare for the offsite was they polled the people. They asked all the people on the team, all 50 of them, what do we need out of this time together? And they really brought people into the conversation to help plan that. And this obviously helps to address the needs, but also just helps people to be bought into what's going to happen during that time together. I'm curious, Nate, Betsy, what are some other variables, things that you start to think about and use as you plan, prepare for these team bonding experiences?
Well, could be another podcast altogether, JP, right? Is just how do we know the pulse of our team, and whether that's using surveys or, consistent one-on-ones or checking in with your players. It's not enough just to read the room. If you're not having consistent conversations and understanding where people are at, it does become more difficult to prescribe group activities that are going to be meaningful and that players are going to understand why we're doing this thing and what we want to get out of it. That's one reason why everything that we do, goes to the captain's council, right? And so if we're planning on a Saturday night activity, sometimes it's, look, here's where I think we're at. Here's what I think we need. Here's my idea. Tell me what you think about that. And 80% of the time, the captains are going to be on board with that. But there have been times where they've said, well, that sounds great, coach, but don't forget, winter formals on Friday night and people are going to be tired, or we've got this thing going on, and we change course, right? Because I don't fully understand the whole context of either that time frame or, kind of where the team is at. And there's other times where I'll come to the captain's council and I'll just ask them, it seems like my read on the situation is that we are tired. What do we need this week? We have this hour on Wednesday. What do we need? We need to get off the court? Do we need to do something fun? Do we need to get away from basketball? Do we need to get away from each other? You guys need to get away from me. I'm not opposed to them doing something even without the coaches if it's for the benefit of the team. But again, that surveillance piece or that knowing the pulse of your team obviously is as important, probably more important, even than the thing that you decide to do in those team building times.
Yeah, involving them in the process is, I think, critical to the success of any team bonding activity. One, you get the buy-in. Two, you have a better sense of context, like you mentioned, Nate, the pulse. It also lightens the load for coaches. And I think that with the best of intentions, sometimes coaches say, well, I need to be responsible for making sure our team is connected. Yes, and you can invite your team to support that or to even source ideas. Even at the beginning of each season, if you make it a fairly innocuous activity, we're going to be doing some team bonding throughout the year. What are some things you've done on other teams that you've been on that you felt were really effective and why? So starting to source or kind of create your own internal bank of options that you can then pull from depending on what's needed at different points in your season. I'll also share a good friend of mine, Nicole Van Dyke. She's the head women's soccer coach at Washington. Program I've worked with before, worked with Nicole when she was at Penn, and then since she's been the head coach at Washington. And she called me, she was so excited earlier this spring. She said, Bets, I did something that I've never done before, and it was amazing. And I was like, what'd you do? Thinking she's going to tell her about this activity. She's like, the other night, I was thinking about what our team needed, and I really like this analogy of a well. And so I just put into ChatGPT, like, team activities related to the analogy of a well. And then I got more specific, like 6-week programming, facilitation question. And in my head, I'm like, shit, I'm out of a job, like this is a big bummer. But I share that only to say there will always be room for the human element. So facilitators out there, if you're thinking, oh no, we just, gave up the secret, you're still needed. And coaches who are listening, you can source now with the help of AI activities or prompts in ways that were harder to come across before. You needed a certain book or you had to talk to a certain expert. You can start to source these things. And sometimes it's enough, especially if you're trying to do this in a more frequent basis and that feels exhausting. It's like, I'd love to do more team bonding, but that's one more thing I have to plan, one more thing I have to think about. Maybe using AI as a resource to help start that conversation or generate some of those ideas, that can be really helpful and supportive for coaches as well.
Yeah, Betsy, I think what you just brought up there is really, really important. And it's something that I know that I've learned just in the last kind of year as I was taking some courses on effective facilitation. I know Nate's doing as well too through 10 Directions, which is, I went to this course around facilitation and I'm thinking, okay, they're going to give me all these tools and frameworks that I can use to, all this content to like deliver really, really great team bonding experiences and retreats. And what I walked away from was like, it's less about the content. It's you can get the content from AI, just like you said. Tell me, ChatGPT, great team activity type of things to do. You can get the content easily. What really matters is, as a facilitator, is how we show up and are we sensing what's going on? within the needs of the group, and are we responding to that? And so I think there's an element of when you're thinking about preparing for, some sort of team bonding experience, yes, you're going to have a plan. You're going to ask people their opinions. What can we do here? And you're going to go out and then you're going to try to execute that. But is to hold that plan lightly and be ready for whatever might emerge for the group. Maybe there's something that comes up there that you need to go and explore with the team. It's a challenge, or it's something that a learning that you might have from some sort of team experience, and you just need to pull back and actually reflect with the group. So presence, just being able to be present with our team is so important. I remember early in the day, about 6-7 years ago, I was doing and facilitating a team bonding kind of team meeting with a college team in Pennsylvania. And I'm doing this work with the team, and the coaches are in the back doing X's and O's, right? They're working on the playbook. I'm like, whoa. Like, what's most important for this team to come together, if you're in the room, is for you to be present, right? Whatever that even just the message is sent, they just need your presence so that you can be engaged in the questions and the discussion. So I think that's a really, really important thing you brought up there. The content is easily sourced. What we need to do as coaches is show up and be present so that we can respond to what's going on in the room.
And I had a similar experience, JP, a couple of years ago, where same thing, college program, coaches brought me in, they're in the room and they're sitting with the team, but they're on their phones. And now they're doing things related to their work, but they were not present for what we were doing together as a group in that space. And it brought to mind for me this idea that as the leader, whether this is a peer leader, a captain, maybe someone on your team, or a coach, whether head coach or assistant coaches, anytime you're with a group as a leader, you can be the standard or you can be the exception, but you can't be both. And I see coaches a lot of times when it comes to team bonding or team building or bringing in a facilitator, step back or step out, and sometimes with purpose, right? So they'll say, well, I know they're going to get more out of this discussion if I'm not in the room. Valid, fair. If you are going to be in the room, please, please, please be fully engaged in that experience. Because when we also hear from coaches, well, they're not really buying into this. It's like, well, have you really bought into this? Are you modeling that for them? And if you can, now it becomes a connected experience. And Nate, to your earlier point, I think that's often also part of the difference between an activity or a meaningful experience is what's the level of engagement across the board? And are we having that reflective conversation? Even when we think about doing things just for fun. And sometimes our team activities are just for fun. And that's great because maybe that's what's needed. Thinking about the purpose is fun, or the purpose is fun with intention. So we're going to do fun with reflection. Like, hey, we're just going to go, like you mentioned, bowling. We're just going to go bowling, just have fun. Or we're going to go bowling and we're going to rotate new team members, or you have to bowl left-handed, or you add some element intentionally that you then reflect on and relate through analogy or story to what's happening in the context of your season. So it's yes, and there's so many different ways you can do team building. And we always think about activities. I need to do this thing. Sometimes I encourage coaches to look at what they're already doing and to make a team bonding activity out of what they're already doing. So, okay, let's say it's basketball. How are you going to make a team bonding activity out of, I don't know, rebounding? Like, work within something that you're already doing and make it a team bonding activity. Because when you ask a coach to do that, they start to think differently about what are the true elements that differentiate an activity from an experience. And then how can I be more intentional, not just in this time with my team, but maybe in other elements of my program or practice to bring that same level of intention to what we experience together.
I think another thing, Betsy, that comes to mind for me when we're trying to come up with an activity for our players to engage in that's more experiential is at the end, I hope that there's discovery, not a lecture. And I think sometimes, we do something and there's a takeaway, like in the curriculum, right? And so we do X, Y, Z. And then at the end of the game, we tell them this is how it's like team, or this is how it's like what we're dealing with right now. And sometimes even those team building times end up becoming a lecture for the coach to just kind of clear the air, get stuff off their chest or whatever it might be. And I think the art of all of this, regardless of what you're doing, is to try to create a place or a space of discovery, which is done as JP mentioned, by being present. It's done by asking the right questions. It's done by leading them without telling them, where they should land or what their conclusions should be. And that's much, much more difficult, right, than just doing an activity and then telling them, here are the takeaways. But when the learning becomes theirs, when it becomes surfaced through their own conversation and their authentic thoughts, what results from that is bonding, right? Because there's a little more vulnerability there. There's a little bit more sharing. There's a little bit more of them being challenged to reflect not just on their own perspective or situation, but on the group. I'll give you a quick example. We used to do an activity at one of our first team dinners where we would take all of our players and coaches and put them in a circle, and we would put rubber bands around everybody's hands. So my left hand is tied to Betsy's right hand. Her left hand's tied to JP's right hand. So everybody in the circle is all tied together. And then we'd go eat dinner. And so from that point, we'd go into our cafeteria and they'd have to figure out how to navigate a taco bar and sit down at different tables while everybody is tied together and eat. So there's all kinds of goofiness that goes on. And, you start to realize when I move my hand toward my mouth, it pulls someone else's hand over as well. And people are falling off laughs and it's fun. And at the end, there's a really valuable conversation where ultimately the place I'm trying to get them is anytime you're on a team, anything that you do, it will affect somebody else in the same way that when you're moving your hands tied to somebody else, no matter what you're doing, you're moving someone else's hand at the same time. So what that actually translates into in terms of how do they apply that to our team, again, is variable, right, from year to year. But trying to get them to that place of discovery creates a much more rich conversation than just doing an activity that's goofy because we're all tied together while we're trying to eat supper.
Yeah, and your story there kind of leads me to this question I wanted to ask the group here, which is, I think a lot of times when your team is going through some struggle, some conflict, you've taken some hard losses, coaches look for the team bonding activity, whatever, that's just going to be like fun. Hey, the team just needs to go have some fun. And yet, when you really look at what is probably getting in the way for that team, fun might be a component to it of that, or may not. But there could be other components. There could be other real purposes or intentions. What would you say, Betsy, are some of those other potential ingredients that would really need to be brought into team bonding experience at some certain points of the season as well?
And when you say that, and I'm all about fun, and there are times where a team does just need to have some fun. I think in the context you're mentioning, JP, there's almost a silent K at the end. Like the team needs some funk. The team needs to talk about something that might be a little bit funky, meaning it's different or it's smelly or disgusting or undesirable. Like we need to go a place that we haven't been because where we've been isn't getting us the results that we want. Sometimes that might be, and I'll do a suitcase exercise sometimes. Sometimes I do this at the beginning of the season. Sometimes I'll do it when a team has reached that place where, we just need some fun. It's like, I don't know that that's exactly the vibe that we need to really focus on here. I'll give a sheet of paper that has a suitcase open on it and that has a lot of different empty lines. And I'll ask people to write down, what are you currently carrying? So within the context of this point in the season, what are you carrying around with you? And very little instruction other than that. So they can write whatever they want to. And then on the back, there's same image, another suitcase, and there's more line. Before I have them flip it over, I invite them to look at the list that they made, everything they're currently carrying. And I want them to circle, typically I do it in red, so we're adding kind of a visual color there. Circle the things that they would like to no longer carry. And then those become the items that we talk about in a group session. Now, you might have someone whose suitcase is full of things they don't want to carry. To mitigate that as a facilitator, I'll invite them to share one thing they're currently carrying that they would like to take out of their suitcase. And we make the analogy of if you're going to fly somewhere, you have a choice. You can check a bag or you can carry on. Depending on the airline that you fly and how heavy your bag is, it's going to cost you to check a bag. So how do we want to take only what we need to move forward in the season? And then after people unpack a few things, and those are typically the funky conversations that we can really benefit from having, on the back side of the paper, again, an open suitcase and a couple lines, I'll ask them if there's anything they want to add to their suitcase moving forward. Sometimes people want to add forgiveness. Some people want to add patience. Some people want to add grace. Some people want to add curiosity. But that can be one of those types of situations where, yeah, it would be great to have fun to get out of this funk that we're in. But sometimes what we need is a more direct conversation about what's not working and how do we address that as a group.
Well, I think, JP, for us, when it comes to kind of some of those mid-season adversities that every team is going to face, we've done a lot with trying to frame those both ahead of time, knowing that, okay, we've got a tough stretch of games coming up here. We're playing 3 teams that are ranked in the top 10, and asking how is that going to be different or more challenging, or what's going to be our biggest challenge, as we see the next 3 games ahead here. And then afterwards, having a conversation about, all right, what did we learn from that experience? How did playing those 3 teams, whether we won or lost or split, how did it help us to get better as we're looking now, to continue through the season here? But I think asking those questions, asking questions about what's our biggest challenge right now as a team, and what's your biggest challenge individually. We have kids write down on note cards, a lot of times do their own response first, and then we'll collect those as coaches at the end of the conversation so that we can follow up with them, as necessary. But when we start to sense some of those things, I just think asking the right questions and creating that safe environment for them to just be able to talk about it or share it in small groups, or even just write it on a piece of paper so that it's been verbalized in some for bonding, right? And Daniel Coyle, you mentioned this before, talks about that vulnerability dance. When it becomes, you take a step forward, you stick your neck out and it's safe and it's okay, you're more likely to do that again. And when other people do that in the group, this greater feeling of unity, even if we're not necessarily unified on all the things that we're saying or discussing, but those are the kinds of conversations that move a team forward and build a team, right? More than just an activity.
Yeah, and what I've heard that you both have shared there is that there's a great power in having questions, very open questions, where you actually have a lot of curiosity. There are obviously some things we're trying to lead our team to certain realizations and self-awareness around things that might be a struggle for them. But what you're really talking about there is coming in with questions where we don't know necessarily what might come up. We don't know what all they're carrying. We don't know what they perceive as getting in the way of the team being successful. And this comes back to present. And I think it also is, for some coaches that might be listening, going, oh my gosh, this is really, challenging to think about it this way. I mean, I guess that's kind of the benefits of being a facilitator. And what I've really learned to stretch myself and work on that is really just trying to sense what's going on in the room. What are people struggling with? And then being able to respond to that. So I think we want to have some structure, obviously, but we can't go too much structure if we're able to really have some great insights and great movement for the team in these experiences. Now, there's another question I want to kind of ask you both here as we're kind of getting close to wrapping up, which is, what do you do when they don't want to do it, right? Like when you're organizing some team experience, team and bonding, and there's the groans, there's that, do we have to, or we don't want to do this, or they're looking for reasons to get out of it, and they're trying to, get their parents to, get them out of some sort of team bonding here. What do you do when they don't want to do it? Do you just pivot? Do you run from that? What do you think, Betsy?
Yeah, anytime there's resistance, for me, that's a huge green flag of curiosity. So what is it that they're resisting? Is it the activity? Is it the time of the activity? Nate mentioned there's the winter formal. It's like, okay, they don't want to do it because they want to have more time to get ready for the thing that they really want to do. For me, any kind of resistance is a sign to get very curious and to start to explore. Sometimes in place of pivoting fully away from the activity and not doing it, it might be, what modifications or adjustments or adaptations do we make? And I often think about conditioning. Like, you get a lot of grumbling before you do conditioning or conditioning tests. And yet we know conditioning is very good for your team. Most sports want athletes that are well conditioned. So if we know that this is likely going to be good for them, but we also understand there's grumbling, sometimes for me, the quickest path through the resistance is also to name it. To say, hey, I know this can feel like we're doing one of those team bonding things again. Here's why we're doing it. Here's what I'm going to invite you into. You don't have to choose that path, but this is the invitation. If we're going to do this, let's make it matter. So that can be, I'll say, one of the shorter, more effective ways of addressing the grumbling is to actually name it. Another, if you have more time, would be to get curious about what is the resistance and why, and then what do we want to do about that? Is this a negotiable thing? If it's, let's say, the time or how long it's going to take, or is it a non-negotiable, or it's like, oh, we just don't want to do anything outside of our normal practice time that we don't have to do. Okay, let's figure it out. There's ways to figure out what the grumbles mean that can be very insightful for how can we do this thing in an elevated way so that it is an experience that we get to have instead of something we have to do.
Well, Betsy, I think your question there of what do the grumbles mean, it is really important in terms of a place to start, because sometimes it's because kids are busy. Sometimes it's because, I think of our first team building activity we'll do during the season is the first Saturday night. So we've had a week of practice. We've gone 2.5 hours for 5 straight days. And now I'm asking them to come back, practice Saturday morning and do something Saturday night. And it's a lot. And so we do start with that accusation audit. We also give back a little bit on that Friday night. So we'll tell them, look, we're going to shorten Friday night. We're going to shorten Saturday morning. So I'm giving them some time back. I'm trying to acknowledge that, right? And then the first one really matters. I mean, the first one that you do and you ask for that commitment and you ask for that time and you make it something that they walk away thinking that was fun, or I enjoyed that, or we feel better about ourselves coming out of it, or whatever it might be, it makes everything else easier, right? If the first one is force-fed and it's Brussels sprouts, it's going to be uphill, for the rest of the season, trying to get them to buy into some of those things. But I think the first one really matters. And so we really try to we cater the best food for the first one, and we really try to vet it through the captains again to make sure it's something people will enjoy. And if they do that, the other thing that we found, JP, is that once our players start to recognize how much better they feel being together after we've done some team bonding, it starts to take on a life of its own. And this is a tradition that's happened over the last 2 years here at Mount Vernon, where some seniors last year started just taking people out to Chick-fil-A after home games on Friday. Like, anybody on the team that wants to go, throw them in the back of the car, let's arrange rides, and they would go eat together. Not the whole team, but everybody was welcome, and whoever could make it would go, right? And the seniors would provide transportation. Well, that morphed into roller skating and sledding. Like, they've started to organize things on their own for fun because they just like being together. And I think part of that is because we invested so much on the front end to establish some of that connection. So I think that's an encouragement to coaches that it doesn't always have to be everything is scripted by the coaching staff or planned by the coaching staff. Sometimes it takes a life of its own, and that actually means less work for me when it's delegated in that way.
Yeah, I really think everyone's context is uniquely different. And so you may actually really just have a really hard time getting your team to do extra outside of practice in games for whatever reason. And that's okay. There are so many things within your just daily experience with your team that you can start to shape and then bring intentionality in to make them team bonding moments. So simply team meals. Anytime your team grabs a meal, whether it's eating at fast food at Culver's after the game, or you're going in sitting down at a restaurant, or you're just having it in the cafeteria or whatever it is, like, there's ways that you can shape that to create unique conversations, right? And just one of the simplest ways is to give the players a bunch of questions that they get to ask each other and learn about each other during the meal. And you can have a little timer and just have them moving tables and just having unique conversations. The phones are away. Like, that's just one way. Another one that I saw ice hockey coach Sam Klassen, that I've worked with the last few years, he started every bus trip where 2 guys would stand up, and then I think it was like 5-10 minutes each, and the whole team would just ask them questions. And they would just spend time fielding these questions, and it was just something they rotated on every bus trip. And they were just getting to learn more about those guys. And people really looked forward to, oh, who's going to be at this bus trip? They almost look forward to that. As well as they started every practice, first period of their season, with a thing they called time with Nate, or time with JP, or time with Betsy. And that person would prepare a 5-minute, 2 to 5 minutes tops, talk on something that they were passionate or interested in. It could be a piece of scripture they've been reflecting on. It could be a book they read on leadership. It could be, one guy talked about lobster fishing, which was his summer job, just whatever it is, just something they're passionate about that they can stand in front of the room and talk to the team about. That was simply 2 to 5 minutes before every practice. So within your own just daily operations of your team, there's plenty of moments to create these team bonding events So don't let the logistics like get in the way for you.
JP, let me give you an example of just kind of how we've thought through this whole process from just last season. So when we lost our last game of the year at the state tournament, we lost on a Thursday afternoon. We're staying at the hotel that Thursday night. We're going back for the championship game on Friday. We've got players that are going to be recognized for all tournament team, et cetera. But we don't really know what to do. Kids haven't been in this situation before where, you've been there, you've lost one game before you're hoping to get to. And so we literally, we just weren't sure. And so I remember getting back to the hotel. We'd gone to eat somewhere and get back to the hotel, just send everybody their rooms and call the captain's meeting downstairs. And I just said, what do we want to do tonight? Or what do you think we need right now? And part of me is do we need to reflect on the season or this game? Do we need to frame it? Do we need to talk through it? Do we need to mourn, over the loss of the season? None of those things really vibe with our captains. And so we kind of just landed on, we just need to be together. We just need to be in the same room. So we went to the front desk and we asked for a room, got a conference room or whatever, and just said, all right, everybody downstairs at 7:45. And so they came into the room. We had nothing planned. We had 3 decks of cards on the table. Some kids played spoons. Some kids played a card game over here. And it was just an excuse for us to be together. Well, then somebody came up with the idea of this would be a lot more fun if we had ice cream. Well, we had kind of a problem. We had a bus driver who had went to bed at 8 o'clock, so we didn't have a way to get anywhere. So I said, well, hang on, let me see what I can do. So I go upstairs, North Lynn, where I'd coached before, staying in the same hotel, broke into Wheatley's room, asked if I could borrow a van, took their van from a different school district, put our entire team in the minivan and drove 5 blocks down the road to the ice cream store. And everybody got ice cream, took pictures in the van, came back or whatever. And then we sent them off to bed and, went on with our day the next day. But in their exit interviews and at the end of the season, I can't tell you how many people talked about how much fun that was. Just that experience of cramming everybody into this van and going to get ice cream was exactly what we needed at the time. And going into it an hour before, I had no idea. And so I think that really just kind of clarifies a lot of the things we're talking about here is being curious about where your team is at and asking good questions and working with your players. And then, as you've said repeatedly, JP, just being open to things emerging spontaneously and going with it, provided it is within the laws of the land, right? And so, but I think that that's a great way just to think about team building is not just an activity. It's what does my team need and being open to that in the moment.
Yeah, and so much of our conversation today for me continually hits on those themes of intention and curiosity. And if I have to sum up, when we think about doing team building really well, or doing things that allow our team to feel more connected or bonded, rarely is it, that the keynote address that they sat and listened to, and it's more that side conversation that they had. It's not that trip that we invested so much money in. It's that, ice cream shop run that we did that was unplanned. So having room for spontaneity and continually asking the questions that you just mentioned, Nate, what does my team need? What can we do for what purpose? And then how do we stay responsive and open and flexible to what comes up? I think if we can have that intention and put it on repeat in a consistent way throughout our season, we're going to find ourselves not only enjoying the fruits of doing this team bonding activity, but really experiencing the results that we get from having a team that's really connected.
All right, that's it for today's episode. If you're interested in coaching, consulting, and facilitation for you and your team, you can reach out to us in the Work With Us link in the details of this episode, or by going over to tocculture.com or betsybutterick.com. Thanks so much for listening in. Please be sure to leave us a review, subscribe, and share this episode with some other coaches that will find value in this message.